Do you feel like you're too old to learn German? Like maybe if you had started 10, 20, or even 30 years ago, it would have worked. But now it's just too late. And maybe every time you open an app or you try to study vocabulary or attempt to speak, you immediately feel overwhelmed and think, maybe my old brain just can't learn languages anymore. Now, let me be very clear here. That belief is simply not true. And how do I know? I've worked with hundreds of students who are learning German later in life and who are making incredible progress in German. For example, Carl, who is my student, started learning German at 72 years old. And after only a couple of months inside my program, he went on his first ever trip to Germany and was able to communicate with native speakers and navigate daily life situations for himself and his wife.
It was a great experience. And I think this time around for me, more so than any other trip I've taken, was the fact that I could speak a bit of the language, and that made such a difference.
So the question is not whether you're too old. The real question is what actually helps someone make progress in learning German later in life. And that's exactly what we're going to break down in today's video. And if you want to make the same kind of progress Carl made, the best place to get started is exactly where he started, which is with my free beginner workshop. Inside, I'll walk you through the most important foundations you need to become confident and conversational in German. So if that sounds like something you want help with, just comment free workshop below and I'll send you the link to get access. So one of the biggest myths people believe about language learning is that age is the problem, that once you reach a certain age, your brain simply can't learn anymore. But learning German successfully has actually far less to do with your age and far more to do with the method you use, how your brain actually learns a language and the way you practice consistently over time. German doesn't feel difficult because you're older. It feels difficult because most people are trying to learn it in a way that doesn't include real life context. And maybe you've experienced this yourself. You learn vocabulary, you watch the videos, you study grammar rules, maybe you even recognize quite a bit when listening. But the moment you try to actually speak, nothing comes out. Or you suddenly can't remember the words you just studied yesterday. And this is especially frustrating for many older learners because it starts to feel like maybe my memory just isn't good enough anymore. But usually that's not the problem. The issue is that most learners are consuming information without training their brain to actively retrieve and use the language in real conversations. And those are two completely different skills. Recognition is not the same as production. Just because you recognize a word when you, for example, see it on an app doesn't mean your brain can automatically access it during a conversation. That ability has to be trained. So if age isn't actually the issue, what is happening when you learn a language? When you learn a new language, you are literally building new connections in your brain between understanding the language and producing it yourself. And at the beginning, those connections are very weak. And that's why speaking can feel painfully slow. Not because you're incapable of learning it, but because your brain hasn't built strong enough pathways yet. And this is where many adult learners become discouraged. But what you're experiencing is completely normal because fluency is not something you intellectually understand yourself into. It's something you train through repetition. Every single time you hear, repeat, read, or use a sentence pattern correctly, you strengthen that connection in your brain. And over time, something really interesting happens. What once felt slow starts feeling automatic. You stop translating every sentence from English, you stop searching for every single word, and speaking starts becoming more natural. And this is exactly what fluency is. It's not talent, it's not intelligence, and it's not age. Fluency is simply the result of building strong, fast neural pathways through consistent repetition and usage. And this brings us to one of the biggest mistakes most German learners make. They spend months trying to memorize individual words instead of training the brain to actually use the language. Because knowing words is not the same as being able to communicate. Your brain does not learn language most effectively through isolated vocabulary lists. It learns it through patterns, through repetition, and through context. So instead of trying to memorize something like gehen equals to go, you want to practice the word inside real phrases and sentence structures, ideally related to your own life. So here are a few examples of how that could look like. Ich gehe nach Hause. Or ich gehe zum Supermarkt. Now your brain is no longer learning one abstract word, it's learning how that word actually functions in a real life context. And the ability to activate it quickly enough during a real conversation comes from repetition. The more often you repeat useful phrases and sentence structures, the more automatic they become. That's why inside my program, we focus so heavily on repetition of high-frequency sentence patterns instead of random memorization, because repeating phrases and sentence structures is what turns knowledge into usable language. It's what helps you move from I study German to I can actually speak German. Another really important thing to help you build confidence as a beginner is improving your pronunciation. Because when people understand you, everything changes. You stop hesitating so much. You stop second guessing yourself. You become more willing to actually speak. And this is something I see all the time with adult learners. Many people think I need more grammar, I need more vocabulary. But often the real issue is that they don't trust the sounds coming out of their mouth. They're afraid they'll say something incorrectly, that the other person won't understand, or that the conversation will immediately switch to English and they are losing the opportunity to practice. And once that happens a few times, people avoiding speaking altogether. That's why pronunciation is such an important foundation early on, because good pronunciation doesn't just help people understand you better, it also helps build confidence incredibly quickly. Now, that does not mean you need to sound like a native speaker. That is absolutely not the goal, especially when you're just starting. But the goal is sounding clear, feeling comfortable when speaking, and being understood. So especially in the beginning, I recommend focusing on a few key German sounds that English speakers often struggle with. For example, the CH sound, like the difference between ich and ach, or the German R sound, and umlauts like ü, ö, and ä. And if you want a clear, structured system that shows you exactly what to practice and how to build these speaking patterns step by step, just comment free workshop below and I'll send you access to exactly that. Inside my free beginner workshop, you'll learn the most important pronunciation foundations, high-frequency phrases you can start using in daily life, and the basic grammar structures that help you build your own sentences correctly. So if that sounds helpful to you, just comment free workshop below and I'll send you the link to register completely for free. Next, let's talk about one of the most important things for remembering words: active recall. Because exposure alone is not enough to remember vocabulary. You need to actively retrieve and use it. And there are a few very simple tools that can help massively with this. For example, using digital flashcards. Here I recommend using Quizlet or Anki. You also want to focus mainly on high-frequency vocabulary that actually appears in daily conversations, because the goal is not to know thousands of random words. The goal is to become functional and conversational as quickly as possible. And every single time you actively recall something correctly, you strengthen that connection in your brain. Now, another thing that slows many adult learners down is fear. And this is actually one of the biggest differences between kids and adults when it comes to language learning. Maybe you avoid speaking because you worry about sounding stupid. And that is completely valid and normal. I don't think I know any language learner, including myself, that didn't go through this. But here is something I've noticed working with successful language learners over and over again. The people who progress the fastest are usually not the people who make the fewest mistakes. They're the people who simply don't let mistakes stop them from speaking and from practicing. They understand that mistakes are not a sign that you're failing. Mistakes are just a part of the process. In fact, making mistakes, receiving feedback, correcting yourself, and trying again is one of the fastest ways your brain actually learns. Children do this naturally, right? They say things incorrectly all the time. Then what do we do as adults? We correct them. They learn and move on. And that willingness to be imperfect is actually one of the biggest advantages you can develop as a language learner. The next ingredient to learn German successfully as an adult is consistency. One of the biggest misconceptions people have about language learning is that they need to study for hours every single day to make progress. But honestly, that's usually not sustainable long term, especially if you're balancing work, family, or simply daily life responsibilities. You do not need exhausting 3-hour study sessions. Your brain will also not be able to digest all of that information, to be honest. But what matters far more is consistency. So 15 to 30 minutes a day done consistently is far more effective than studying intensely once every week. Because every time you come back to the language, you reinforce those neural pathways we've talked about earlier. So focus on regular exposure, regular speaking practice, and repetition of core sentence structures. And that's what creates momentum over time. And this is exactly how learners like Carl made such incredible progress. Not through talent, not through perfect memory, and not through studying 8 hours a day, but through consistent repetition and the right structure. Learning a language successfully is not about age, it's not about talent, and it's not about intelligence. It comes down to repetition, the right method, and consistent use in real-life situations. So if you've been telling yourself, I'm too old to learn German, I hope this video helped you realize something important. You're not too old. You've simply been using the wrong approach, and if you want help building the right foundation from the beginning, the best place to get started is with my free beginner workshop. Inside, I'll walk you through the exact foundations that help adult learners become confident and conversational in German. From pronunciation, sentence building, to practical phrases you can actually use in real life. So if you're ready to finally start learning German in a way that actually makes sense, just comment free workshop below and I'll send you the link to register completely for free. And if you want to learn more about how to actually remember German vocabulary effectively and stop forgetting words the moment you try to use them, make sure to watch this video next here, where I'll show you the best way to learn and retain new words step by step. Das ist alles für heute. Vielen Dank fürs Zuschauen und bis zum nächsten Mal. Tschüss!